The Vampire King's mute son had never uttered a single word in his 300 years of existence, until Nanny Sophia started humming an ancient lullaby while folding his clothes in the laundry room. What no one knew was that the melody held the key to breaking the curse that had stolen his voice, and now the desperate Vampire King would do anything to keep her. The Vampire King stood in the doorway of his study like a carved statue, his pale fingers gripping the ancient oak frame until the wood creaked under the pressure. Sophia backed against the far wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain every supernatural creature in the castle could hear it, while Adrian remained frozen between them, his silver eyes darting from his father to the woman who had given him back his voice. Lucian stepped into the room with fluid grace, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a death knell in the sudden silence. The study was a cathedral of knowledge, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound tomes that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy, while glass cases displayed artifacts that caught the candlelight and threw twisted shadows across the Persian rugs. A human skull sat on the massive mahogany desk next to an ornate silver goblet, and Sophia's stomach lurched as she realized the dark stains around its rim were not wine. Lucian moved to stand behind his desk, his movements predatory despite their apparent calm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I am Lucian Blackthorn, the Vampire King of the Eastern Territories, and that boy you've been caring for is my son Adrian. Cursed to silence for 300 years until your voice broke the spell that has tormented our family since before your grandmother's grandmother was born." Sophia pressed her back harder against the wall, feeling the cold stone seep through her sweater as her mind struggled to process words that should have been impossible. But the evidence stood before her in Adrian's otherworldly beauty and Lucian's inhuman grace. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The Vampire King continued, his pale blue eyes never leaving her face, as he explained how Adrian had been born during a brutal war between vampire factions, when old bloodlines fought for territory and power with a savagery that made human conflicts look like children's games. A witch named Morgantha the Cruel had cursed the infant prince in revenge for some perceived slight, binding his voice with magic so dark and twisted that every word he spoke would carry the power to destroy whatever he loved most. Lucian's hands clenched into fists as he spoke of the years that followed, how he had searched the world for a cure, consulting every magical being from ancient shamans to modern witches, spending fortunes on spells and potions that did nothing but mock his desperation. The curse was specifically designed to be unbreakable, Morgantha had told him with her dying breath, unless the key to his son's voice came willingly and with a pure heart. Someone whose bloodline carried the memory of older magic, someone who could sing the songs that predated the curse itself. Sophia felt her legs trembling as the impossible truth settled over her like a suffocating blanket, and she opened her mouth to protest that this was all madness, that vampires didn't exist and curses were fairy tales. But the words died in her throat as she remembered the way Adrian had moved with impossible grace, and the way his single word had shattered every piece of glass in the laundry room. "You are that key," Lucian said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper that somehow carried more menace than if he had shouted. "Your bloodline, your voice, your instinctive knowledge of melodies that have been lost for centuries. These are what my son needs to break free from his prison of silence, and I will give you anything you desire to stay and help him." He gestured to a leather portfolio on his desk, and when he opened it, Sophia saw bank statements with numbers that made her student debt look like pocket change, deeds to properties in cities around the world, stock certificates and jewelry that glittered even in the dim candlelight. "Name your price and it's yours," Lucian continued, but his eyes held a darkness that suggested refusal was not truly an option. "All I ask is that you remain here and continue working with Adrian. Help him learn to control his voice so he can finally live the life that was stolen from him before he could even speak his first word." Sophia found her voice at last, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Let me go," she managed to say. "I want to leave right now. I want to forget any of this ever happened. I want to go home and pretend that vampires and curses are just stories people tell in the dark." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were futile, because Adrian stepped forward from where he had been standing silent and still, and his lips parted to release his second word into the world. "Stay," he said, and the single syllable carried such longing and desperate hope that Sophia felt her heart break even as every window in the castle cracked with the force of his emotion. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the corridors like a crystal symphony, and servants could be heard running through the halls to assess the damage. But Sophia could only stare at Adrian as she realized the terrible power that lived in his voice. His silver eyes were wide with shock and fear at what he had done, and he pressed his hands to his mouth as if he could somehow take the word back, but it was too late, and they all knew it. Lucian moved around the desk with inhuman speed, reaching for his son with hands that shook with emotion, but Adrian backed away from both of them until he stood alone in the center of the room. "I'm sorry," Adrian whispered, and this time his voice was so quiet, it barely stirred the air, but still Sophia heard the crystal chandelier above them chime softly in response. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I can't bear the thought of being silent again, of watching you walk away like everyone else always does." Sophia looked between father and son, seeing the desperation in Lucian's ancient eyes and the centuries of loneliness in Adrian's young face, and she knew that whatever choice she made in this moment would change all their lives forever. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, against every rational thought telling her that vampires were monsters and curses were impossible, Sophia heard herself agreeing to stay for 1 week. 1 week, she repeated firmly, meeting Lucian's relieved gaze with what she hoped was steel in her own eyes. 7 days to see if I can actually help Adrian, and then I leave and you let me go without any interference. Lucian inclined his head in what might have been agreement, or might have been polite dismissal of her naive demands, but Adrian's face lit up with such pure joy that Sophia felt her resolve waver dangerously. The next morning she found herself in the music room with Adrian, a space she hadn't seen before that was clearly designed for the work they were about to undertake. The walls were lined with instruments from every era and culture, from ancient harps with strings that gleamed like silver wire to modern keyboards that hummed with electronic potential, and the acoustics were so perfect that even her breathing seemed to create harmony. Sophia began with simple exercises, having Adrian hum along while she sang scales and basic melodies, and she discovered quickly that not all songs worked the same way. Some melodies seemed to agitate the magic in his voice, making the air around them crackle with dangerous energy that set her nerves on edge, while others calmed and contained his power like a gentle hand guiding a wild animal. The melodies that worked best were old ones. Songs she remembered her grandmother humming while she worked in her garden, lullabies that had been passed down through generations of women in her family who had never known their true significance. When Adrian hummed these ancient tunes, his voice blended with hers in ways that defied explanation, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the castle, and during these moments he could speak freely without fear of destruction. "Tell me about your life," Sophia said during one of these safe spaces, when their voices had woven together into something larger than either could create alone. Adrian's silver eyes grew distant as he shared fragments of his existence, 3 centuries of watching the world change, while he remained forever frozen in the body and face of a 12-year-old boy. He told her about the loneliness of immortality in halting sentences that grew stronger as the days passed, how he had watched servants and tutors age and die while he remained unchanged, how he had taught himself to read and write and think in dozens of languages, but had never been able to share his thoughts with another soul. His father tried to help, Adrian whispered during one evening session when the setting sun painted the music room in shades of amber and gold. He brought me companion after companion, other young vampires who were supposed to be my friends. But they were all afraid of what my voice might do, and I was afraid of what I might accidentally say to them. So I learned to be quiet, to express myself through gestures and written words. But there's something about speech that writing can never capture. Something about the way thoughts become real when you speak them aloud that I had forgotten until you came here. Sophia found herself drawn deeper into Adrian's world despite her fears. Learning about the complex politics of vampire society and the weight of being heir to a throne he had never asked for. The curse wasn't just personal torment, he explained. It was political protection as well, because a vampire prince who couldn't speak, couldn't challenge the current power structures or invoke the ancient laws that might disrupt the carefully maintained balance between the various vampire factions. His silence had kept the peace for 3 centuries, but it had also kept him from truly living. And now that his voice was returning, the entire supernatural world was taking notice. Sophia became aware of this attention when she began seeing unfamiliar faces in the castle corridors, pale, elegant figures who moved with the same predatory grace as Lucian and watched her with calculating eyes. Mrs. Grimwald explained that these were vampire nobles who had heard rumors about Adrian's progress and had come to see for themselves whether the stories were true. Some were allies of Lucian's faction who saw Adrian's returning voice as an opportunity to strengthen their political position, while others belonged to rival bloodlines who viewed the prince's newfound power as a threat to their own carefully guarded territories and privileges. The attention made Sophia nervous, but it seemed to energize Adrian, who had been isolated for so long that even potentially hostile visitors were preferable to the empty silence that had defined his existence. During their sessions, he began to speak more freely, sharing stories and opinions and dreams that had been locked inside him for centuries. And Sophia found herself forgetting sometimes that she was talking to someone who had lived through the rise and fall of empires. His mind was sharp and curious, shaped by endless reading and observation, but his emotional development had been stunted by his isolation, leaving him in some ways remarkably innocent despite his ancient age. The breakthrough came on their 5th evening together, when Sophia decided to try something she had been hesitating to attempt. Instead of having Adrian simply hum along while she sang, she encouraged him to add his own vocal part to the melody, creating true harmony rather than just accompaniment. The result was unlike anything either of them had experienced before, their voices weaving together into something that seemed to resonate with the magical foundations of the castle itself. The ancient stones began to pulse with a warm light that emanated from within the walls themselves, and doors that had been sealed for decades swung open with soft sighs, as if the building itself was awakening from a long sleep. Portraits along the corridors shifted and moved, their painted eyes following the sound of their combined voices, and the very air seemed to thicken with power that made Sophia's skin tingle with electricity. In the music room where they sat, instruments began to play themselves in harmony with their song, creating a symphony that filled every corner of the castle with music that spoke of magic older than memory. Adrian's eyes were wide with wonder and fear as he felt the extent of what they could create together, but he didn't stop singing. And neither did Sophia, both of them lost in the beauty and terror of their combined power. From the shadows of the corridor outside, Lucian watched with an expression that mixed joy and dread in equal measure. Because while he was thrilled to see his son finally accessing his full potential, he also understood better than anyone the dangerous implications of what Adrian and Sophia could accomplish when their voices joined together. That night, after the magical resonance had finally faded and the castle had settled back into its usual quiet, Adrian spoke to Sophia in full sentences for the first time since his curse had begun to break. He told her about the night 3 centuries ago when Morgantha the Cruel had come to their castle under the guise of a diplomatic visit, how she had seemed like nothing more than an elderly human woman until the moment she revealed her true nature and the depth of her hatred for Lucian's bloodline. His mother had tried to protect him, Adrian said, his voice growing stronger and clearer with each word, as if the act of finally telling his story was healing something deep inside him. She threw herself between the witch and my cradle, and Morgantha's curse caught her instead of me at first, draining her life force to power the magic that would bind my voice. But my mother used her dying breath to sing me a lullaby, the same one you hummed that first night in the laundry room. And somehow her love changed the curse from something that would have killed me into something that merely silenced me. The lullaby became the key to my eventual freedom, woven into the very fabric of the binding spell, waiting for someone with the right bloodline and the right heart to come along and sing it back to life. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to Adrian's story, understanding now why her grandmother's simple lullaby had held such power and why Lucien was so desperate to keep her at the castle. She was not just a random woman who had stumbled into their lives, but the descendant of magical bloodlines that connected her to the very curse that had stolen Adrian's voice, and the melody that had been passed down through her family was literally the key to his freedom. As Adrian continued to speak, telling her about the loneliness and isolation of his cursed existence, about watching the world change from his silent prison while longing to be part of it, Sophia felt something shifting inside her own heart. The fear and confusion that had dominated her thoughts since learning the truth about the supernatural world began to give way to something else, a connection to this strange boy who had lived for centuries but was in many ways younger than she was, who had been denied the most basic human experience of communication until she had unknowingly given it back to him. Their emotional bond deepened with each shared story and each successful harmony they created together, but it was complicated by the vast differences in their natures and circumstances. Adrian was immortal while she was human. He was incredibly wealthy and powerful while she was struggling to pay off student loans. He was part of a supernatural world that followed rules she barely understood, while she was an ordinary woman who had stumbled into magic by accident. Yet despite these differences, or perhaps because of them, Sophia found herself drawn to Adrian in ways that frightened and confused her, feeling a connection that went deeper than mere sympathy or professional obligation. She began to understand that her week at the castle was changing her just as much as it was changing Adrian, and as the seventh day approached, she realized that leaving might be far more difficult than she had originally imagined. The discovery came by accident on the sixth evening of Sophia's stay, when she found herself alone in the castle's vast library while Adrian rested and Lucien attended to the growing number of visitors who had been arriving throughout the week. The library was a maze of towering shelves that stretched up into shadows the candlelight couldn't penetrate, filled with books and scrolls and manuscripts that chronicled centuries of supernatural history, and Sophia had been drawn there by a restless curiosity about the world she had stumbled into. She was examining a section devoted to human-vampire relations when her fingers brushed against a leather-bound journal that seemed to pulse with warmth at her touch, and when she opened it, she found herself staring at a portrait that made her blood freeze in her veins. The woman in the painting could have been her twin, with the same dark hair and gentle features, the same intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge and compassion, and written beneath the image in elegant script was the name Elena Nightingale, first voice keeper and guardian of the ancient songs. Sophia's hands trembled as she turned the pages, reading Elena's own words about her role as liaison between the human and vampire worlds, during an era when the two species had coexisted in careful balance, rather than the fearful separation that characterized modern times. Elena had been born with an unusual gift, the journal explained, a bloodline that carried the genetic memory of songs that predated written history, melodies that could influence the very fabric of magical reality when sung by someone with the proper heritage and training. She had used these abilities to help maintain peace between vampires and humans for decades, serving as translator and mediator and keeper of ancient knowledge that both sides needed, but neither fully understood. The journal detailed Elena's work with various vampire bloodlines, how she had helped resolve territorial disputes and succession crises through careful application of binding songs and harmony magic, but it also spoke of the growing tensions that would eventually tear apart the delicate alliance she had spent her life building. Elena had foreseen the coming conflict, Sophia read with growing fascination and dread. The war that would drive vampires into hiding and humans into willful ignorance of the supernatural world that existed alongside their own. And she had made provisions to preserve her knowledge and abilities through her descendants. The binding songs would be passed down through the women of her line as lullabies and folk melodies, their true purpose hidden, but their power intact, waiting for the day when they would be needed again to bridge the gap between worlds. Elena had been present at Adrian's cursing, Sophia discovered with shock, had in fact been the one to suggest the specific form the curse should take when it became clear that Morgantha's original spell would kill the infant prince rather than merely silencing him. Working with Adrian's mother, Elena had woven her own magic into the witch's curse, transforming it from a weapon of destruction into a complex lock that could only be opened by someone carrying Elena's bloodline and singing the songs she had embedded into the spell's very structure. The journal's final entries spoke of Elena's hope that someday one of her descendants would find their way to the Blackthorn Castle and complete the work she had begun, breaking not just Adrian's curse, but opening the door to a new era of cooperation between the supernatural and human worlds. As Sophia read these words, she felt the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed, clicking into place around her, and she understood, with crystal clarity, why Lucian had been so desperate to keep her at the castle and why her voice had such a profound effect on Adrian's curse. She wasn't just a random woman who had stumbled into their lives by chance, but the culmination of Elena's centuries-long plan, the key that had been carefully crafted and passed down through generations to unlock the prison that held Adrian's voice captive. The revelation was overwhelming and terrifying, and strangely liberating all at once, because it meant that everything that had happened to her had been destined in some sense, that her presence here was not accident, but inheritance, not coincidence, but the fulfillment of a legacy she had never known she carried. When Lucian found her in the library hours later, still clutching Elena's journal with tears streaming down her face, he took one look at the book in her hands, and his expression shifted from concern to a complex mixture of relief and desperation that told her he had been waiting for this moment since the day she arrived. "Now you understand," he said softly, settling into the chair across from where she sat, surrounded by scattered papers and open books. "Now you know why I cannot let you leave, why I will do whatever is necessary to keep you here with Adrian, because you are not just his hope for freedom, but potentially the key to healing the rift between our worlds that has existed for centuries." Sophia looked up at him with eyes red from weeping and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she began reading Elena's words. "Did you know who I was when you hired me? Did you plan all of this? Or was it really just coincidence that brought me here?" Lucian's ancient eyes held a sadness that spoke of centuries of disappointment and failed hopes as he explained that he had been searching for Elena's descendants for decades, following bloodlines and family trees through endless genealogical research, but that Sophia's family had been particularly difficult to trace because Elena's daughter had taken a different name when she married and moved to another continent. He had hired dozens of women over the years who showed even the slightest connection to Elena's lineage, bringing them to the castle in various capacities, hoping that one of them would prove to be the key his son needed. But none of them had possessed the specific combination of bloodline and natural ability that Sophia carried. When he had seen Sophia's application for the nanny position, her background in music therapy and her grandmother's maiden name had been enough to make him take the chance. But he had not known for certain that she was Elena's descendant until the moment her lullaby cracked Adrian's curse and proved that the ancient magic still flowed in her veins. The political implications of Sophia's heritage became clear the next evening when Lady Serafina Valdris arrived at the castle with a retinue that included some of the most powerful vampire nobles from across the Eastern Territories. Serafina was a vision of elegant menace, with platinum blonde hair that fell like silk to her waist, and pale green eyes that seemed to see through to the soul, and she moved through the castle's great hall as if she owned it, rather than merely visiting. Sophia watched from the gallery above as Lucian received his guests, with the formal courtesy that centuries of politics had taught him. But she could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hand rested near the ceremonial sword at his side. Adrian stood beside his father during the formal presentations, his newfound ability to speak allowing him to participate in court rituals for the first time in his long existence. But Sophia noticed how carefully he modulated his voice, and how Serafina's eyes tracked his every word with calculating interest. The noble lady's court included representatives from bloodlines that Sophia had learned to recognize during her week at the castle, ancient families whose power and influence stretched across continents, and whose allegiances shifted like quicksilver depending on the political winds. After the formal greetings were concluded and the visitors had been shown to their rooms, Sophia found herself summoned to a private meeting in Lucian's study, where Serafina waited with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted her ability to get what she wanted. The vampire lady studied Sophia with those unsettling green eyes, taking in everything from her simple clothing to the way she held herself, and when she spoke her voice carried the cultured accents of centuries of education and refinement. So you are Elena Nightingale's descendant, the woman who has managed to accomplish what hundreds of the finest magical minds have failed to achieve for 3 centuries, Serafina said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How fascinating that such power should manifest in someone so, shall we say, unprepared for the implications of what she has awakened. Lucian moved to stand protectively near Sophia as Serafina continued, explaining with silky politeness exactly why Adrian's returning voice was such a significant threat to the carefully maintained balance of vampire society. The prince's bloodline carried claims to territories that had been redistributed among other families during his centuries of silence, ancient laws that could be invoked to challenge current power structures, and upset arrangements that had kept the peace for generations. His voice was not just a personal liberation, but a political weapon that could reshape the entire supernatural landscape, and many of the older bloodlines had grown comfortable with the status quo that his curse had helped maintain. Serafina's solution was elegantly simple and utterly ruthless, she explained with the same pleasant tone she might have used to discuss the weather. Adrian would come to live at her estate, where he would be treated with all the luxury and respect due his royal status, but he would be kept safely away from influences that might encourage him to use his voice in ways that could destabilize the existing order. Sophia would be compensated handsomely for her services and return to her human life with memories carefully adjusted to remove any trace of her supernatural experiences, ensuring that the secret of the Voicekeeper bloodline remained safely buried. Lucian's refusal was immediate and absolute, his voice carrying the authority of a king who had not held his throne for centuries by backing down from challenges. But Serafina merely smiled and played her final card with devastating effectiveness. The Vampire Council had been monitoring the situation at Blackthorn Castle with growing concern, she revealed, and there were serious questions being raised about the wisdom of allowing unsupervised magical experimentation that could potentially destabilize the entire supernatural world. If Lucian continued to refuse reasonable compromise, she would be forced to report her concerns to the council, which would almost certainly result in their direct intervention and the immediate cessation of all contact between Adrian and his Voicekeeper. The implicit threat hung in the air between them like poison, because everyone in the room understood that council intervention would mean not just separation, but likely the permanent binding of Adrian's voice through methods far more brutal and irreversible than his original curse. Sophia felt the walls of the study closing in around her as she realized that she had become a pawn in a political game whose rules she didn't understand and whose stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, while Adrian stood frozen in horror at the thought of losing his voice again, just as he was learning to use it. The conversation that followed Serafina's departure was conducted in harsh whispers in Lucian's private chambers, where Sophia finally understood the true extent of the trap that had closed around her during her week at the castle. Lucian made his position brutally clear, his ancient eyes holding a desperation that had evolved into something harder and more dangerous over the course of their discussion. He would not allow Adrian to be taken by Seraphina, would not permit the council to destroy the progress they had made, and would use any means necessary to protect both his son and the woman who had become the key to his freedom. When Sophia demanded to know what that meant, when she insisted on her right to leave and return to her own life, Lucian's mask of civilized courtesy finally slipped to reveal the predator underneath. "You are no longer just a human woman who stumbled into our world by accident," he told her with quiet intensity. "You are Elena Nightingale's heir, the last voice keeper, the only person alive who can complete the work that was begun 3 centuries ago. And I will not allow you to walk away from that responsibility simply because you are frightened of its implications. The castle can be made comfortable for you," he continued, his tone growing more reasonable, but no less implacable. "You will have access to resources and luxuries beyond anything you could achieve in the human world, opportunities to study magic and history that no human scholar has ever been offered, but you will not be permitted to leave, and you will not be allowed to refuse the heritage that flows in your blood." Sophia felt panic rising in her throat as she realized that her week of supposed freedom had been an illusion, that from the moment she had first hummed Elena's lullaby, she had ceased to be a free agent in her own life, and had become instead a valuable resource to be protected and controlled. She had traded her student debt and uncertain future for a different kind of prison, one decorated with silk and gold, but no less confining for its luxury. Adrian appeared in the doorway as if summoned by her distress, his face pale with anguish as he took in the scene and understood what his father was proposing to do. Sophia turned to him with desperate hope, believing that the boy she had come to care for would not allow her to be held against her will. But Adrian's response revealed the depth of his own desperation and the centuries of loneliness that had shaped his character. "Please don't leave me," he said, his voice carrying power that made the windows rattle in their frames. "I know it's selfish, and I know you have a life outside these walls, but I cannot bear the thought of returning to silence, of spending eternity alone again, now that I know what it means to have someone who understands me." His words hit Sophia like physical blows, because she could hear the genuine love and need behind them, but she could also see how her own feelings were being weaponized against her by two immortal creatures who had learned to take what they needed to survive, regardless of the cost to others. The emotional manipulation was all the more effective because she knew it was not entirely calculated, that Adrian's feelings were real even if they were being used to trap her, that Lucian's desperation came from genuine love for his son, even if it was expressed through control and coercion. She found herself caught between compassion and fury, between the desire to help Adrian continue his recovery and the need to escape before she lost herself completely in their supernatural world. As the argument continued and positions hardened, Adrian's distress grew more acute, and his control over his voice began to slip, until finally, his emotions overwhelmed his careful restraint, and he spoke a sentence that carried the full force of his awakening power. "I would rather return to silence than keep you here against your will," he said, and the words hit the castle's foundation like an earthquake, sending cracks racing through the ancient stones and causing centuries-old tapestries to fall from their hangings in clouds of dust and decay. The raw power in his voice when it was uncontrolled by Sophia's harmonizing influence was terrifying and destructive, proving that the fears of the vampire nobles were not entirely unfounded, but it also demonstrated Adrian's essential goodness and his unwillingness to purchase his freedom at the cost of someone else's captivity. In that moment, with the castle shaking around them and the sound of his unrestrained voice echoing through corridors that had been silent for centuries, Sophia realized that her choice was not really between freedom and captivity, but between embracing a destiny she had never asked for or watching the destruction of two people she had come to love, despite the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. The Vampire Council descended upon Blackthorn Castle like a storm made manifest, their arrival announced by the sudden dimming of every light source within a mile radius, and a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep through stone walls as if they were made of paper. Elder Marius led the procession, a figure so ancient that his presence seemed to bend reality around him. His pale skin stretched tight over bones that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, while his eyes held the cold wisdom of millennia spent ruling from the shadows. Behind him came the 12 members of the High Council, each one a legend in their own right, vampires whose names were whispered in fearful reverence throughout the supernatural world, and whose combined power could reshape entire continents if they chose to exercise it. Sophia watched from the gallery as they filed into the great hall with ceremonial precision, their black robes flowing like liquid darkness, and their faces masks of implacable judgment that spoke of decisions already made and fates already sealed. The formal hearing began at midnight, conducted according to traditions that predated most human religions, with Lucian and Adrian standing before the assembled council like defendants at a trial where the verdict had been predetermined. Elder Marius spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the grave itself, explaining that the council had received troubling reports about unauthorized magical experimentation taking place at Blackthorn Castle, activities that potentially threatened the carefully maintained balance between the supernatural and human worlds. They had come to investigate these claims and to take whatever action was necessary to protect both species from the consequences of reckless ambition and misguided hope. Sophia was called forward as the key witness, her legs trembling as she walked across the marble floor under the scrutiny of beings who had ruled in darkness since before her ancestors learned to make fire. And when Elder Marius fixed his ancient gaze upon her, she felt as if her very soul was being weighed and measured. The council already knew everything, she realized with growing horror, from the moment she had first hummed Elena's lullaby to the political maneuvering that had followed Seraphina's visit, and they had come not to investigate, but to pass sentence on activities they had been monitoring from the beginning. Elder Marius revealed the true history of Adrian's curse with clinical detachment, explaining that the young prince's situation was not unique, but rather the latest in a series of similar cases that the council had dealt with over the centuries. There had been other voice keepers, he said, other descendants of Elena's bloodline, who had been discovered and brought to various vampire courts in attempts to break curses and unlock ancient magics. But every single attempt had ended in catastrophic failure. The magical forces involved were simply too powerful and unpredictable for mortal minds to safely control, and the results had included burning villages, mass casualties among both human and vampire populations, and magical disasters that had required decades of careful cover-up to prevent exposure of the supernatural world. The most recent incident had occurred only 50 years earlier. Elder Marius continued with the same emotionless tone, when a voice-keeper named Margaret Songbird had attempted to break a similar curse affecting a vampire noble in Romania. The woman had successfully restored the nobleman's voice, but the uncontrolled magical feedback had created a wildfire that consumed 3 towns and killed hundreds of innocent people before the council's intervention teams could contain the damage. Margaret herself had been driven mad by the experience, spending her final years in an asylum babbling about songs that only she could hear, and the vampire noble had been executed by council decree to prevent future incidents. These failures were not accidents or coincidences, the elder explained, but inevitable consequences of attempting to manipulate magical forces that were beyond human comprehension and control, which was why the council had established strict prohibitions against any further experiments involving voice-keeper bloodlines. The decree that followed was delivered with the same inexorable certainty as a natural disaster. Elder Marius announcing that Sophia Chen would submit immediately to magical binding that would permanently seal her ability to sing the ancient songs, effectively severing her connection to the voice keeper heritage and ensuring that Adrian's curse would remain intact forever. The binding would be performed by council mages, using methods that had been perfected over centuries of dealing with similar situations, and while Sophia would retain her normal speaking voice and musical abilities, she would never again be able to access the specific melodies that could influence supernatural magic. Adrian would be returned to his previous state of enforced silence, but he would be allowed to remain with his father rather than being taken into council custody, a mercy that Elder Marius indicated was being granted solely out of respect for Lucian's long service to vampire society. The pronouncement fell over the great hall like a death sentence, and Sophia felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that everything she had experienced over the past weeks was about to be stripped away by creatures who viewed her as nothing more than a dangerous anomaly to be neutralized. Adrian's reaction was immediate and devastating, his desperate rage overriding every lesson in control that Sophia had taught him as he stepped forward and spoke his defiance in a voice that carried the full force of his awakening power. "You have no right to take away what my mother died to preserve," he declared. And the words hit the great hall like a physical force that sent cracks racing across the vaulted ceiling and brought down chunks of stone that had stood for centuries. The ancient windows exploded outward in showers of colored glass, while the marble floor buckled and split under the pressure of his unrestrained voice. And several of the younger council members actually staggered backward as the sound waves battered against their supernatural defenses. Elder Marius remained unmoved by the display, his expression showing only grim satisfaction, as if Adrian had just proven every point the council had made about the dangers of uncontrolled voice-keeper magic, while the other council members began weaving protective spells that shimmered in the air like heat mirages. The destruction continued for several more seconds before Adrian's voice finally broke under the strain, leaving him gasping and trembling while dust and debris settled around them like snow. And in the sudden silence, Elder Marius spoke again with cold finality. "You have just demonstrated exactly why the council's decision is not only justified, but urgently necessary," he said, gesturing to the ruined hall around them. "This castle has survived wars and sieges and natural disasters for over 1,000 years. Yet a single emotional outburst from an untrained voice-keeper wielder has caused more structural damage than any external enemy ever managed to inflict. Imagine what would happen if such power were unleashed in a populated area among humans who have no defenses against magical forces and no understanding of what was killing them." The hours that followed the council's pronouncement were filled with frantic planning and desperate whispers as Lucian marshaled every resource and ally he could trust in a last-ditch attempt to save both his son and the woman who had become the key to Adrian's freedom. Mrs. Grimwald proved to be the crucial ally, her ancient loyalty to the Blackthorn family overriding any fear of council retribution as she revealed knowledge that even Lucian had not suspected she possessed. The old servant had been Elena Nightingale's personal attendant during her years at the castle, she explained in the privacy of Lucian's study while council guards patrolled the corridors outside, and she had helped Elena establish the magical sanctuary hidden in the mountains where voice keepers had once trained safely away from political interference. The sanctuary still existed, Mrs. Grimwald insisted, protected by wards and enchantments that had been designed specifically to hide voice-keeper activities from council detection. And if they could reach it before the binding ceremony was scheduled to take place, then Sophia might have a chance to fully embrace her heritage and gain enough power to protect herself and Adrian from further interference. The plan that emerged from their hurried conference was desperate and dangerous, requiring them to slip away from the castle during the pre-dawn hours when the council's attention would be focused on preparing the binding ritual. But it represented their only hope of escaping the fate that Elder Marius had decreed for them. Lucian would create a distraction by formally challenging the council's authority in open court, a move that would certainly result in his own destruction, but would buy precious time for the escape attempt, while Mrs. Grimwald and her network of loyal servants would guide Sophia and Adrian through secret passages that led to the mountain paths. The most crucial decision fell to Sophia herself, who would have to choose whether to undergo the dangerous transformation that would unlock her full voice keeper abilities and bind her permanently to the supernatural world, or remain as she was and accept the limitations that such a choice would impose on her power to help Adrian. Mrs. Grimwald explained the process with clinical precision, describing how Elena's descendants could access their complete heritage through a ritual that would awaken every dormant magical gene in their bloodline and grant them conscious control over the ancient songs that had previously manifested only as instinct. The transformation would make Sophia powerful enough to shield herself and Adrian from council interference, but it would also make her immortal and cut her ties to the human world forever, trapping her in the supernatural realm as surely as any prison. Adrian listened to these explanations with growing horror, understanding that his quest for freedom was about to cost Sophia everything she had known and loved about her previous existence, and he began to seriously consider the alternative that no one else wanted to discuss. If he allowed the council to re-silence him permanently, using methods that would make reversal impossible even with voice keeper intervention, then Sophia would be free to return to her human life without the binding that Elder Marius had decreed. The curse had been his burden to bear for 3 centuries, he argued with desperate logic, and he had no right to drag an innocent woman into eternal imprisonment simply because he was tired of being alone and silent. The debate that followed revealed the depth of feeling that had developed between all 3 of them during their brief time together. With Lucian torn between his paternal devotion and his rational understanding of the impossible situation they faced, while Sophia struggled to balance her growing love for Adrian against her terror of losing her humanity forever. The decision was ultimately postponed by practical necessity as the time for their escape attempt approached, but the emotional weight of the choice hung over them like a sword as they made final preparations to flee the castle that had become both sanctuary and prison. The betrayal came at the worst possible moment, just as Sophia and Adrian were making their way through the ancient tunnels that Mrs. Grimwald had revealed beneath the castle's foundations. They had successfully avoided the council's patrols and were within hours of reaching the mountain sanctuary when torchlights suddenly blazed ahead of them, and Lady Seraphina stepped into view with a squad of her personal guards blocking their path. The vampire noblewoman's smile was triumphant and coldly satisfied as she explained that she had been monitoring their plans from the beginning, using magical surveillance spells that had been keyed to track any attempt at escape from the moment the council's decree was announced. One of Lucian's most trusted servants had been in her employ for decades, feeding information about the Blackthorn family's activities to rival bloodlines who were always eager to gain advantage over the powerful king, and every detail of their desperate plan had been reported to Seraphina within minutes of its conception. She had allowed them to begin their escape attempt because capturing them in the act of fleeing council justice would provide additional evidence of their guilt and make it easier to justify harsher punishments than Elder Marius had originally proposed. Adrian's reaction to seeing Sophia threatened was instantaneous and catastrophic, his protective instincts overriding every consideration of safety or consequences as he stepped forward to shield her from Seraphina's guards. The sound that emerged from his throat was unlike anything he had produced before, a pure note of power that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of reality itself, and the effect on their surroundings was immediate and terrifying. Ancient binding spells that had been woven into the castle's very stones began to unravel under the assault of his voice, releasing magical energies that had been contained for centuries and causing artifacts throughout the castle to flare to life with dangerous intensity. Protective wards failed in cascading sequences that sent shockwaves through the supernatural defenses that had kept the castle hidden from human detection, while above them in the Great Hall, the council members scrambled to contain magical forces that were spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. Seraphina's guards were thrown backward by the sheer force of Adrian's voice, their supernatural strength useless against sound waves that carried enough power to shatter mountains. But the vampire lady herself proved more resilient than expected, using a magical amulet that had been crafted specifically to defend against voice keeper attacks. She weathered Adrian's assault long enough to launch her own counterattack, sending binding spells racing toward Sophia with lethal precision. The young woman barely managed to dodge the magical projectiles, but her evasive movement carried her directly into the path of Seraphina's guards, who recovered quickly enough to seize her arms and drag her away from Adrian, despite his increasingly desperate attempts to break free from the magical restraints that Seraphina was weaving around him. Lucian arrived in the tunnels too late to prevent the capture, but in time to witness the full extent of what his son had become when pushed beyond all limits of control and reason. Adrian's voice had evolved beyond mere sound into something that approached pure creation and destruction, each word he spoke reshaping reality around him in ways that defied every known law of magic. But his power was useless to save the woman he loved from enemies who had planned for exactly this contingency. The sight of Sophia being dragged away while calling his name pushed Adrian past the breaking point, and his final scream of rage and despair brought down entire sections of the tunnel system, while awakening magical forces throughout the castle that had been dormant since the Age of Legends. As the ancient stones crashed down around them and magical energies crackled through the air like lightning, Lucian realized with crystalline clarity that the cautious approach he had pursued for centuries was no longer sufficient to protect the people he loved, and that the only way to save both his son and Sophia might be to embrace the very chaos and destruction that the council feared most. The chamber where Seraphina held Sophia prisoner was a study in elegant cruelty, its silk-draped walls and antique furnishings creating an atmosphere of refined luxury that made her captivity all the more psychologically devastating. Sophia sat on the velvet window seat, with iron shackles around her wrists, staring out at the moonlit gardens, while her captor entertained guests in the rooms below, their laughter and conversation drifting up through the floorboards like mockery of her desperate situation. She had been imprisoned for 3 days since the failed escape attempt, 3 days of wondering whether Adrian was safe and whether Lucian had survived the council's wrath after their defiance became known, and the uncertainty was eating at her sanity like acid. Lady Seraphina visited her twice each day with offers of comfortable surrender, promising that submission to the council's decree would be swift and painless, that Sophia could return to her human life with only the haziest memories of her supernatural experience. But each refusal seemed to amuse rather than anger the vampire noblewoman. On the third night, when despair had driven her to examine every inch of her prison for some means of escape, Sophia discovered that the chamber had a history that connected directly to her own family's legacy in ways she could never have anticipated. Hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace was a leather satchel that contained Elena Nightingale's most private and dangerous writings, journals that had been concealed here during the final days before the Great War between humans and vampires tore apart the carefully maintained alliance she had spent her life building. Elena had lived in these very rooms for the last months of her mortal existence, Sophia realized as she read her ancestors' increasingly desperate entries, working frantically to complete the magical safeguards that would preserve the Voice Keeper bloodline through the dark centuries she knew were coming. The journals revealed truths that neither Lucian nor the council fully understood about the nature of Adrian's curse and the real purpose behind its creation, secrets that Elena had hidden even from her closest allies because the knowledge was too dangerous to trust to anyone who might be corrupted by political ambition or personal agenda. The curse that bound Adrian's voice was not simply a punishment inflicted by a vengeful witch, Elena's final entries revealed, but a carefully crafted magical construct that she herself had helped design as a failsafe against the coming chaos. Adrian's bloodline carried the genetic potential for Voice Keeper abilities, despite his vampire nature. a combination that could theoretically grant him power over both supernatural and human magical systems. But such unprecedented authority would make him a target for every faction that sought to control or destroy the fragile balance between worlds. Elena had worked with Adrian's mother, and even with Morgantha the witch, to create a curse that would hide the young prince's true abilities until the time was right for their revelation, using the appearance of vindictive punishment to mask what was actually an elaborate protection spell designed to keep Adrian safe until a descendant of Elena's line could unlock his full potential. The curse was never meant to be permanent, the journals explained, but rather a chrysalis that would eventually transform into something magnificent when the proper conditions were met. Those conditions required a voice keeper who truly understood the cost of the magic she wielded and who was willing to sacrifice her mortal existence to become something entirely new, neither human nor vampire, but a bridge between worlds with the power to heal the ancient wounds that divided the species. Elena had built the transformation ritual into the very structure of Adrian's curse, hiding it so cleverly that even centuries of magical investigation had failed to detect its presence. But she had also left detailed instructions for her descendant, who would eventually be called upon to complete the work she had begun. The ritual required the voice keeper to sing all 7 verses of the complete binding song, verses that had been scattered and hidden throughout the supernatural world to prevent anyone from assembling them until the proper time arrived, and each verse would cost the singer something irreplaceable until by the end she would have surrendered her mortal nature entirely. Sophia read these revelations with growing awe and terror, understanding that Elena had orchestrated events across centuries to ensure that this moment would eventually come to pass, that every hardship and loss the Voice Keeper bloodline had endured was part of a larger plan designed to preserve both species from mutual destruction. The knowledge was overwhelming and liberating at the same time, because it meant that her presence at Blackthorn Castle had never been coincidence but destiny, that she had been shaped by forces beyond her understanding to fulfill a purpose that transcended her personal desires and fears. Adrian's rescue attempt came like a force of nature made manifest, his unrestrained voice preceding him through Seraphina's stronghold, like a hurricane of pure sound that shattered windows and buckled walls with each word he spoke. The young vampire prince had evolved far beyond the tentative speaker Sophia had helped train, his 3 centuries of suppressed communication exploding outward in a torrent of power that defied every natural law and magical principle that governed reality. Stone crumbled at his command, while metal bent and twisted as if it were clay, and the very air seemed to thicken around him as his voice reshaped the fundamental forces that held matter together. Seraphina's guards tried desperately to stop him, using weapons and spells that had been forged specifically to combat supernatural threats. But Adrian's voice had become something beyond their ability to counter or contain. When he spoke a single word of banishment, enemy vampires found themselves hurled through walls with bone-crushing force. And when he sang a note of unbinding, magical restraints simply ceased to exist, as if they had never been created in the first place. The vampire lady herself met him in the great hall of her estate, her own considerable powers marshaled for a battle that she had been preparing for since the moment she captured Sophia. But even Seraphina's centuries of magical study and political cunning proved insufficient against the raw creative force that Adrian had become. Their confrontation shook the very foundations of the estate, while outside the windows, the Vampire Council's forces surrounded the building, Elder Marius and his followers having tracked Adrian's magical signature through the supernatural defenses that should have concealed Seraphina's stronghold from detection. In the tower room where Sophia was imprisoned, she could hear the battle raging below and knew that time was running out for all of them, that soon the council would intervene with methods brutal enough to stop Adrian regardless of the cost to innocent bystanders. Elena's instructions were clear about what needed to happen next, but the price of following them was almost too terrible to contemplate, even in their desperate circumstances. The complete binding song that would transform Adrian's curse into a blessing required Sophia to give up her humanity verse by verse, each stanza stripping away another aspect of her mortal nature until she became something that had never existed before in the history of either species. The first verse would cost her the ability to age and die naturally, binding her to immortal existence but leaving her essentially human in all other respects, while the second would grant her conscious control over voicekeeper magic at the price of never again being able to live safely among ordinary humans who would instinctively recognize her supernatural nature. The third and fourth verses would reshape her physical form to survive magical energies that would burn mortal flesh from bone, while the fifth would open her mind to the collective memory of every voice keeper who had ever lived, granting vast knowledge but threatening her individual identity with the weight of centuries of accumulated experience. The sixth verse would bond her permanently to Adrian's essence, creating a magical symbiosis that would amplify both their abilities but make separation impossible without destroying them both. And the final verse would complete her transformation into the first voicekeeper guardian, a being capable of bridging human and vampire worlds but forever changed beyond recognition from the woman she had once been. Sophia began to sing even as Adrian's battle with Seraphina reached its climax, her voice weaving through the chaos of combat as she performed the ritual that Elena had designed to save both species from the consequences of their ancient hatred. The first verse transformed her immediately, youth and vitality flooding through her body as mortality fell away like a discarded garment, and she felt her perspective shifting as the promise of endless time stretched before her consciousness. The second verse brought power beyond anything she had previously imagined, conscious control over melodies that could reshape reality itself. But with it came the knowledge that she could never again walk unnoticed among the humans she had once called her people. Each subsequent verse cost her more while granting abilities that compensated for the loss, her human limitations falling away as she became something unprecedented and magnificent, and utterly alien from what she had been only minutes before. The transformation reached its culmination as Adrian broke through Seraphina's final defenses and reached the tower where Sophia sang the ancient words that would redefine both their natures forever. His voice joined with hers in perfect harmony as she reached the seventh and final verse, their combined power creating resonances that shattered every magical barrier in the estate, while outside the council's forces found themselves unable to advance against the wall of sound that surrounded the building like a fortress made of music itself. Adrian's curse didn't break under the assault of the complete binding song, but rather transformed into something magnificent and unprecedented, his voice losing its destructive edge as it became a tool of creation and healing rather than chaos and ruin. Where once his words had brought down ceilings and shattered windows, now they could mend broken stone and heal wounded flesh, and the power that had made him dangerous became the force that would eventually heal the ancient wounds between human and vampire societies. Sophia completed her own transformation as the final notes of the binding song faded into silence, her human mortality replaced by something that was neither mortal nor vampire, but partook of both natures in ways that created entirely new possibilities for cooperation between the species. She could feel Adrian's presence in her mind like a warm flame that would never be extinguished, their magical natures now so intertwined that separation would be impossible. But instead of feeling trapped by this bond, she experienced it as liberation from the loneliness that had defined both their previous existences. Lady Seraphina lay unconscious amid the rubble of her shattered stronghold, her own magic having been overwhelmed by the combined force of their transformed abilities, while outside the estate, Elder Marius and the council found themselves facing a situation that none of their ancient precedents had prepared them to handle. Adrian was no longer the dangerous anomaly they had come to contain, but rather something entirely new that defied their traditional categories of threat and control. And Sophia had become the first voice-keeper guardian in recorded history, a being whose very existence suggested possibilities for human-vampire cooperation that had been dismissed as impossible fantasies for centuries. The battle was over before it had truly begun, not because one side had defeated the other, but because the fundamental nature of the conflict had been transformed by magic older and more profound than any force the council could bring to bear against it. In the aftermath of their transformation, as they stood together in the ruins of Seraphina's estate with their voices still harmonizing in ways that made the air itself shimmer with possibility, Sophia and Adrian realized that they had not simply broken a curse or escaped political persecution, but had become the foundation for an entirely new relationship between the human and supernatural worlds that neither species had dared to imagine possible. The months that followed their transformation saw changes ripple through vampire society with the inexorable force of an avalanche, as word spread through supernatural communities around the world that the ancient barriers between human and vampire cooperation had finally been breached. Adrian's voice, now capable of creation rather than destruction, became the instrument through which new covenants could be forged between species that had spent centuries in mutual fear and suspicion, his words carrying magical authority that could bind agreements across the supernatural divide in ways that political treaties had never managed to achieve. Sophia's role as voice-keeper guardian evolved naturally from her unique position as bridge between worlds, her transformed nature allowing her to serve as translator and mediator in negotiations that would have been impossible when conducted through normal diplomatic channels. The Vampire Council, faced with the reality of changes they could no longer prevent or control, grudgingly acknowledged that Adrian and Sophia represented evolution rather than revolution, a natural progression of magical development that promised stability rather than chaos for the carefully maintained balance they had spent centuries protecting. Elder Marius proved surprisingly adaptable to the new circumstances, his ancient wisdom recognizing that opposition to inevitable change would only create the very instability the council feared most, and he became an unexpected ally in the delicate process of rebuilding relationships between vampire nobles who had been enemies for generations. Lucian threw himself into this diplomatic work with the energy of someone who had been given a second chance at life, his relief at seeing Adrian whole and happy, providing motivation for efforts that extended far beyond simple political necessity into genuine desire for lasting peace between the species. The Blackthorn Castle became a center of learning and cooperation, where young vampires and gifted humans studied together under the guidance of teachers who understood both magical traditions, while Sophia established schools throughout Europe and America where voice-keeper descendants could be identified and trained safely away from the political pressures that had destroyed previous attempts at supernatural education. Adrian discovered a love for teaching that surprised everyone who had known him during his cursed years, his voice becoming an instrument of instruction and inspiration, as he helped preserve histories that had been nearly lost during the centuries of separation between human and vampire communities. The quiet moments they shared in the evenings, working together in the same laundry room where their journey had begun, provided anchors of personal happiness amid the larger work of reshaping two civilizations, and their voices blending in harmony as they sang the lullabies that had started. Everything created magic that healed rather than harmed, built rather than destroyed. Through the windows of that familiar room, they could see children playing in the castle gardens, the first generation of humans and vampires to grow up together in friendship rather than fear. And the sight filled them both with hope for a future that their sacrifices had made possible. Lucian often watched them from the doorway during these quiet times, no longer the desperate king who had been willing to imprison someone to protect his son, but a father who had learned that true love sometimes required the courage to let go and trust in powers greater than political control or parental authority. The transformation that had saved Adrian and Sophia had also freed Lucian from centuries of guilt and desperation, allowing him to become the leader his people needed for the new era they were building together, rather than the guardian of old fears and ancient hatreds that no longer served any constructive purpose. As the seasons turned and their work expanded into regions that had never known peace between the species, Sophia and Adrian began to understand that their personal love story had become something larger than themselves, a symbol of possibility that gave hope to others who dreamed of bridging seemingly impossible divides through patience and understanding rather than force and coercion. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and the Blackthorn Castle bore little resemblance to the Fortress of Shadows and silence it had been when Sophia first walked through its imposing gates with nothing but a suitcase and nervous hopes about caring for what she thought was a selective, mute child. The corridors that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with laughter and conversation as young vampires and humans moved between classrooms where they studied together under the guidance of teachers who understood both magical traditions and mortal concerns. The great hall where the Vampire Council had once pronounced their harsh decree had been transformed into a library and meeting space where representatives from both species gathered regularly to discuss matters of mutual interest. Their debates, spirited but respectful in ways that would have been impossible during the centuries of separation and suspicion that had defined relations between their peoples. Adrian had discovered within himself a gift for teaching that surprised everyone who had known him during his cursed years, his voice becoming an instrument of education and inspiration as he helped preserve the histories and traditions that had nearly been lost during the dark period when vampires withdrew from human contact entirely. His classes drew students from across Europe and beyond, young people eager to learn about the interconnected heritage of human and vampire civilizations from someone who had lived through much of that history himself and could speak of it with the authority of personal experience rather than mere academic study. Sophia found herself adapting to immortality with a grace that amazed her, the overwhelming nature of her transformation gradually settling into something that felt natural and right as she established schools throughout the world where voice-keeper descendants could be identified and trained in environments that prioritized safety and understanding over political advantage or personal gain. Her work took her far from the castle for weeks at a time, but the magical bond she shared with Adrian meant that distance could never truly separate them, their connection remaining strong regardless of the miles between them and providing comfort during the challenging early days of building institutions that had no historical precedent to guide their development. The Voicekeeper schools became havens for young people who had always felt different without understanding why, places where they could learn to control abilities that might otherwise have driven them mad, or made them targets for supernatural forces that sought to exploit their gifts for selfish purposes. Each school was built according to principles that Elena Nightingale had outlined in her hidden journals, designed not just to teach magical skills, but to foster the kind of wisdom and emotional maturity that would allow voice keepers to use their power responsibly, rather than being corrupted by it, as so many had been in previous generations. Sophia's transformation had given her access to the collective memories of every voice keeper who had ever lived, and she drew upon this vast repository of experience to create curricula that balanced practical training with ethical instruction and historical context that helped students understand their place in the larger story of human supernatural cooperation. The political implications of their work extended far beyond education. As vampire nobles who had once viewed human-vampire cooperation as dangerous fantasy began to recognize the practical advantages of partnership over perpetual conflict. Trade agreements were negotiated that allowed vampires to provide services that their immortal nature made them uniquely qualified to perform, while humans offered resources and innovations that vampire society had been cut off from during their centuries of isolation. The carefully maintained secrecy that had protected vampire communities for so long began to evolve into something more sophisticated, a system of controlled disclosure that allowed for greater integration while still protecting both species from the chaos that full revelation might cause among populations unprepared for such knowledge. Adrian's voice played a crucial role in these negotiations, his words carrying magical authority that could bind agreements in ways that made traditional diplomatic protocols seem primitive by comparison, and his presence at treaty ceremonies became a symbol of the new era that was emerging from the ashes of ancient prejudices and fears. Lucian found himself busier than he had been in centuries, his role expanding from regional vampire king to something more like an international ambassador as other supernatural communities sought to learn from the success of the human-vampire cooperation that was flourishing in his territory. The transformation of his relationship with Adrian brought him deep personal satisfaction. As he watched his son grow into the leader he had always had the potential to become, once freed from the curse that had defined his early existence. The guilt and desperation that had driven Lucian to consider imprisoning Sophia against her will had been replaced by pride in his son's accomplishments and gratitude for the sacrifices that had made Adrian's freedom possible, and he often found himself marveling at how much richer their family life had become now that Adrian could speak freely about his thoughts and feelings, rather than being trapped in perpetual silence. The evening ritual that had become their favorite time of day began as it always did, with Sophia and Adrian meeting in the laundry room that held such significance in their shared history, their voices joining together in the lullabies that had started their journey toward understanding and love. The room itself had been restored after the magical damage caused by Adrian's early attempts to speak, but they had deliberately kept it simple and functional, rather than transforming it into something grander, both of them finding comfort in the familiar domestic setting where their relationship had first begun to develop. Their voices blended now with an ease born of months of practice and the deep magical connection that bound their natures together, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate through the very stones of the castle and fill every corner with music that spoke of healing rather than destruction, of building rather than breaking down the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. The magic they created together had evolved far beyond the desperate experiments of their early days into something beautiful and purposeful, their combined abilities allowing them to weave spells of protection and prosperity that benefited everyone who lived within the castle's influence and extended far into the surrounding countryside where human and vampire communities were learning to coexist in ways their ancestors would never have believed possible. As they worked together folding the clothes that represented the mundane reality underlying all their magical accomplishments, Sophia often reflected on how much her life had changed since the day she answered Lucian's advertisement for a nanny position, how the woman she had been then could never have imagined the extraordinary destiny that awaited her in this ancient castle filled with secrets and supernatural inhabitants. The student debt and career uncertainty that had once seemed like the most important problems in her world now felt like memories from someone else's life, replaced by responsibilities and opportunities that stretched across centuries and continents in ways that made her former concerns seem almost quaint by comparison. Yet despite the vast scope of her new existence, she found that the moments she treasured most were these quiet times with Adrian, when they could simply be together without the weight of their larger mission pressing down upon them, when their voices could create harmony for its own sake rather than to accomplish some diplomatic or educational goal. Adrian had grown into his restored voice with remarkable grace, his centuries of enforced silence having taught him to value communication in ways that made every word he spoke feel deliberate and meaningful, and his gift for storytelling had become one of his most powerful tools for bridging the gap between human and vampire understanding. During their evening sessions, he would often share stories from his long existence, tales of historical events he had witnessed, and people he had known during the centuries when he could only observe rather than participate. And Sophia found these narratives endlessly fascinating, as windows into a world that was simultaneously ancient and remarkably relevant to their current circumstances. The children they could see through the laundry room window represented the future they were working to build. The first generation of humans and vampires to grow up together as friends and classmates, rather than as natural enemies, separated by fear and ignorance. Some of these children were young vampires whose families had moved to the castle to take advantage of the educational opportunities and political stability that Lucian's territory now offered, while others were humans whose voice keeper heritage or other magical gifts made them natural candidates for the integrated curriculum that had become the castle's signature contribution to supernatural education. Watching them play together with the unconscious ease of childhood, racing through the gardens in games that would have been impossible when strict separation between the species was the norm, filled both Sophia and Adrian with hope for a future where cooperation rather than conflict would be the defining characteristic of human-vampire relations. Their laughter carried through the evening air as a counterpoint to the lullabies that drifted from the laundry room window, creating a symphony of voices that seemed to embody everything they had worked and sacrificed to achieve. Lucian's presence in the doorway had become as much a part of their evening routine as the songs themselves, the vampire king finding comfort in watching his son, and the woman who had become their family's salvation as they shared the simple domestic moments that had been impossible during Adrian's cursed years. The transformation in Lucian's own character had been almost as dramatic as the changes in Adrian and Sophia, his desperate need to control and protect having evolved into something more mature and trusting as he learned to find security and strength rather than in the illusion of absolute power over circumstances that were ultimately beyond any individual's ability to direct. The political pressures that had once driven him to consider imprisoning Sophia against her will now seemed like the actions of a different person, someone whose fear and isolation had warped his judgment in ways that made genuine love and trust impossible to sustain. The father he had become was someone who could take pride in his son's independence and accomplishments, rather than viewing them as threats to carefully maintained control, someone who could appreciate Sophia's sacrifice and transformation without feeling threatened by the bond she shared with Adrian, or jealous of the attention that bond required from both of them. His own relationship with both of them had deepened and matured as the months passed, evolving from the desperate alliance of their early days into something that resembled the kind of family connections he had always wanted, but had never known how to create when his son was trapped in silence and his own emotions were dominated by guilt and frustration. The castle that had once felt like a mausoleum for dead dreams had become a home in the truest sense, filled with voices and laughter, and the kind of purposeful activity that made immortal existence feel meaningful rather than merely endless. The diplomatic receptions and educational conferences that brought visitors from around the world to their gates were sources of satisfaction and pride, rather than necessary evils to be endured, because they represented the fruits of sacrifices that had been willingly made, rather than policies imposed by political necessity or fear of consequences beyond their control. As he listened to Adrian and Sophia singing together in the room where everything had begun, Lucian often found himself thinking about the night when Adrian had first spoken Sophia's name and shattered every piece of glass in the castle with the force of emotions that had been suppressed for 3 centuries. How that moment of destruction had actually been the beginning of creation in ways that none of them had understood at the time. The harmony they created now was the antithesis of that initial chaos, their voices blending in ways that built rather than broke down, that healed ancient wounds rather than opening new ones, that promised a future where different species could find common ground rather than eternal conflict. The magic that flowed from their combined abilities had become a cornerstone of the new world they were building together. Proof that cooperation was not only possible, but actively beneficial for everyone involved in ways that competition and suspicion could never match. Their voices rose and fell in melodies that had been passed down through generations of voice keeper women who had never known the true significance of what they were preserving. Songs that carried within them the keys to understanding and cooperation that had waited centuries for the right moment and the right people to unlock their potential. The evening light streaming through the laundry room window seemed to dance in harmony with their music, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that shifted with each note and phrase. While outside in the gardens, the children's games continued as natural accompaniment to the ancient melodies that spoke of hope rather than despair, of building bridges rather than maintaining walls, of finding harmony between voices that had once been raised only in anger or fear. The future stretched before them with infinite possibility, no longer constrained by the limitations that had defined human-vampire relations for centuries, but open to whatever they could imagine and build together through the patient work of understanding and the magic that flowed when different voices chose to sing in harmony rather than discord.